Hello there. This is the read aloud for lesson 4.12, Different Lives. Although the United States was known as the land of opportunity, life was tough for many people. Many poor immigrants had difficulty adjusting. They faced harsh conditions and frequently had to work long, hard hours. Frustrated farmers grew weary of trying to coax crops out of rocky, depleted soil. Many headed west to look for a better life. In the South, thousands of slaves would have loved to head west, but they were not free to do so. Their workday started at sunup and frequently lasted well into the night. On most large plantations, enslaved workers had to endure humiliation and hard labor. They lived in constant fear of the lash or being sold and separated from their families. Goals for this lesson: recognize the reasons for immigration and the hardships immigrants faced, and recognize major economic and social characteristics of the southern and western states between 1820 and 1850. Okay, grab your reading guide and lesson answer key, and let's start with reading pages 320 through 327. Okay, we read 320 and 321 in the previous recording. That was talking about the South and slavery. So I'm going to start up with page 322, the Slaves' New Year Day. Harriet Jacobs spent most of her adult life as a Northern abolitionist, but she spent her first 30 years as a slave in North Carolina. Her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, was rediscovered in the 1960s, and scholars were able to confirm its authenticity in 1981. During her years as a slave, Jacobs experienced the agony she describes below, the sale of a mother's children. Hiring Day in the South takes place on the 1st of January. All you happy free women, contrast your New Year's Day with that of the poor bondwoman. With you it is a pleasant season, and the light of day is blessed. Children bring their light offerings and raise their rosy lips for a caress. They are your own, and no hand but that of death can take them away from you. But to the slave mother, New Year's Day comes laden with peculiar sorrows. She sits on her cold cabin floor, watching the children who may all be torn from her that next morning, and often does she wish she and they might die before the day dawns. One of these sale days I saw a mother lead 7 children to the auction block. She knew that some of them would be taken from her, but they took all. The children were sold to a slave trader, and their mother was bought by a man in her own town. Before night her children were all far away. She begged the trader to tell her where he intended to take them. This he refused to do. How could he, when he knew he would sell them one by one wherever he could command the highest price? I met that mother in the street, and her wild, haggard face lives day to day in my mind. She wrung her hands in anguish and exclaimed, "Gone, all gone! Why don't God kill me?" I had no words wherewith to comfort her. Instances of this kind are daily, yea, of hourly occurrence. Slave resistance and slave codes. Around 2 a.m. on August 22, 1831, 6 slaves, armed with axes and clubs, crept into the darkened farmhouse of their master in Southampton County, Virginia. They were led by their fellow slave and preacher, Nat Turner. In the first act of the bloodiest slave rebellion in the history of the United States, they killed the master, his wife, and 2 children, and a teenage apprentice in their beds. After that, the group marched from house to house, shooting, clubbing, or hatcheting every white they met, all the while gathering more troops from the slave population. By the time a white patrol stopped them in the next afternoon, Turner's band had grown to include from 60 to 80 blacks. They killed close to 60 whites, mostly women and children. Rebellions were rare, despite the often appalling conditions which slaves lived. Nat Turner was both the largest and last major slave uprising in the United States. Estimates vary, but reliable accounts report that 20 of Turner's band were eventually hanged and another 10 were exiled. In the 10 days that followed the uprising, white militias killed more than 100 blacks. Some of the victims were slaves, others free, and many had nothing to do with the rebellion. Turner himself was eventually captured and hanged. News of Nat Turner's rebellion shocked Southern whites. They believed their slaves to be faithful and devoted. Could they really be capable of such violence? Whites now lived in fear of large-scale slave revolts. "I have not slept without anxiety in 3 months," a Virginian wrote. "There has been and still is panic in all this country." Lawmakers responded by tightening already restrictive regulations and by passing new laws called slave codes, which sought to keep slaves under stricter supervision. Because Turner was rumored to have been influenced by abolitionist literature, some slave codes barred whites from teaching their slaves to read. Others prohibited groups of blacks from assembling and forbade slaves from carrying firearms. Many Southerners blamed Northern abolitionists for inciting rebellion. One planter warned that even the mention of slavery in Congress would incite death and destruction in the South. Slave folklore and indirect resistance. For slaves, to engage in active rebellion was to invite almost certain death. In the quest to maintain their dignity, some slaves found safer ways to resist. They might work slowly, purposely forget orders, or sabotage tools. Folklore passed from generation to generation offered lessons in dealing with whites. Stories of Brer Rabbit, short for Brother Rabbit, and other trickster tales feature resourceful animal characters who countered their adversaries with cleverness and quick thinking. Though he was smaller and weaker, Brer Rabbit always managed to outwit his enemy. From these stories, which often subtly and indirectly ridiculed white society, slave children learned the benefits of caution and wariness in their interactions with their masters. Escaping on the Underground Railroad. Thousands of slaves did manage to escape and head for freedom in the North. They represented only a small portion of the more than 4 million black people who were enslaved by the eve of the Civil War, but their example aggravated the dread felt by whites while inspiring hope in other slaves. Although not as dangerous as rebelling, becoming a runaway slave was a huge risk. White patrols combed southern roads, stopping any black person who looked suspicious. Slaves picked up by these patrols would rarely return to their owners alive. To avoid patrols, fugitives moved at night, hiking 10 to 20 miles at a stretch before bedding down in the barns and cellars of sympathetic local residents. From the end of the 1700s, a loosely organized network of blacks and whites in the border states helped to house escaped slaves and pay for their passage north by train or ship. This network came to be called the Underground Railroad. One successful runaway, Harriet Tubman, returned 19 times to her native Maryland to lead fugitives from safe house to safe house. At her own peril, she ushered some 300 slaves to freedom along the Underground Railroad. Rewards for her capture reached $40,000, but she was never caught. Once they arrived in the North, fugitive slaves often encountered racism almost as bitter as what they had left behind. Many had trouble finding work or were threatened and bullied. Their children were usually not allowed to attend school with white children. By mid-century, only 5 northern states, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Maine, permitted black men to vote. In New York, where all white men had the right to vote, black men could only vote if they met a property requirement. A few western states even refused to allow free blacks to live within their borders. Nevertheless, for those slaves who managed to escape, the journey north was well worth the risk. However restrictive life was in free states, it was better than slavery. The West, the gifts of fortune. For Americans in the early 1800s, the meaning of the West shifted with the times. Later chapters in this book will focus on pioneers who from the 1840s on traveled far west on the Oregon Trail and Santa Fe Trail. In 1820, however, the West lay just beyond the Appalachian Mountains, in the fertile, largely unsettled region between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, part of which is now called the Midwest. From both the north and south, settlers came to this frontier, gradually turning fur trading posts into frontier towns and firmer woods and prairies into fertile fields. Economic hardships in the East Coast states led to a population boom in the nation's interior. As the population grew, the price of eastern farmland rose. In New England, centuries of continual planting were depleting the soil, which meant less abundant crops than in earlier decades. As word filtered east about cheap, fertile land beyond the Appalachians, more and more families decided to move west. Migrants from New England and the mid-Atlantic states traveled to the new states of Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan, and to the territories beyond. Southerners sought new lands for growing cotton in Alabama, Mississippi, Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas, all of which became states between 1817 and 1845. In 1810, about 14% of the American population lived west of the Appalachians, but just 30 years later that figure increased to 40%. Between 1820 and 1840, the population of Illinois tripled and then tripled again. After a visit to America in the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville, a French historian and author of Democracy in America, an astute analysis of American ways, observed that millions of men are marching at once toward the same horizon. Their language, their religion, their manners differ. Their object is the same. The gifts of fortune are promised in the West, and to the West they bend their course. If the West promised gifts of fortune, nothing was simply handed to the new pioneers. When they arrived, they faced a tough first few years. Preparing the land for planting required digging up the tough prairie sod, hacking at tree stumps, and hauling away rocks. Farmers and their families lived in hastily constructed shelters such as three-sided huts, hillside dugouts, or tents. Once the labor of clearing was finished and the first crop was in, families could begin to build a log cabin. For these early pioneers, life on the prairie was hard. Terrible thunderstorms and tornadoes ravaged the flat plains. Some families gave up and moved back east, but more stuck it out. Neighbors, churches, and schools became focal points of prairie life and gave otherwise isolated families a network of support. But these transplants from different American regions did not always get along. Northerners and Southerners brought their regional biases and suspicions with them. These two groups, like their doubles back east, remained suspicious of each other for decades to come. Going and growing west. Before the railroads and the Erie Canal, pioneers trekked in west in carts or even on foot. Following Indian trails and wagon roads, they traveled under a dense green canopy of trees through the eastern forests. They made their way over mountains and through woods that suddenly gave way to prairie, a vast sea of grass that seemed to stretch on forever. In the decades after the Revolution, Western farmers who wanted to sell their crops to Eastern markets had to ship them by water, since land transportation costs were too expensive. Thus, to be near water routes, those early settlers confined themselves to the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. Many pioneers traveled to their new homes by flatboats, which were giant rafts cobbled together from lumber. The voyages proved dangerous. These clumsy vessels frequently overturned in rapids or ran aground in shallows. Riverside encounters with the Native Americans or thieves could turn deadly. The National Road, on which construction began in 1811, opened a new way west. Stagecoaches and Conestoga wagons, large horse-drawn carts with canvas covers, crowded the new turnpike. Along the route, taverns and villages where travelers often stopped grew quickly into towns. As the steamboat replaced the flatboat and the railroad replaced the stagecoach, the trip west became even faster and safer. Transportation improvements also made it easier and cheaper to ship agricultural products to distant eastern markets. Western farmers started to concentrate on growing staple crops like wheat rather than crops for their own consumption. Westerners benefited from the technological innovations of the Jacksonian Age. Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper and John Deere's steel plow, introduced in the 1830s, allowed prairie farms to produce even larger harvests. Southwestern plantations produced twice as much cotton as their counterparts in the East. Northwestern farms were far more fruitful than the equivalent acreage in New England. The fertile prairie lands along the Mississippi became America's breadbasket, providing the growing country with food. With the money they made, Western farmers purchased manufactured goods shipped from the East, such as factory-made furniture, Connecticut clocks, ceramics, and glassware. Western commodities were sold in Eastern markets and fed residents of Eastern cities, while Eastern products filled Western dwellings. Just as North and South were bound together by economics, West and East were bound by train tracks and waterways into one huge market economy. Okay, I'm going to stop here and finish up with this reading in the next recording.